Welcome to Decoded, providing in-depth insight into cybersecurity. How do organisations react to a ransomware attack? In this special episode, we talk to someone who has unique insight into the effects that ransomware have on businesses. And we also examine the grey area between good and bad applications. Our special guests are Jeremy Kirk from the Ransomware Files podcast and Dennis Batchelder from AppEsteem. Show notes, including any links mentioned in the show, are available at decodedcyber.com. Ransomware is on everyone's minds at the moment. It's the type of threat that really focuses the thoughts of people who run businesses. This is because it's such an obviously bad thing with a clear financial penalty attached to it. If you get hit by ransomware, the attackers will attempt to extort a specific amount of money from you, and you then have to clean up afterwards, close any loopholes that you find, and plan for future attacks. Hacks that steal information are clearly bad, and you can face huge fines for losing people's personal information, but it's hard to quantify how expensive it is when someone steals your intellectual property. A ransom, on the other hand, is a very clear threat that any executive can understand. You don't have to be a business genius to understand that a company paralysed by lockdown computers is in trouble, and that paying criminals thousands of pounds or dollars is a bad thing. Jeremy Kirk is an IT journalist with a long history of covering security issues. He runs an excellent podcast called the Ransomware Files, in which he talks to victims of ransomware and discusses their experiences. There are some very cautionary tales on his show, and he joins us now to talk about what it's like to get hacked and to share his observations when dealing with victims. Jeremy, people don't usually want to talk about ransomware. Is that because they have company policies that stop them discussing it?
It could be. I mean, some of the organizations I've approached have had active legal cases related to loss of data. I won't name the company, but I know that one had like a pending class action suit. I thought I'd try them anyway, just to see if they would talk about it. But I mean, generally, companies and organizations, they really, especially private companies and publicly listed companies, they don't want to talk about this. And I said before, it's like, asking a company about, or a person about what was your worst day, and usually it's the day that ransomware strikes. So, some organizations have been more forward than others. However, like if I take like the education sector, right? Like they when I kind of pitch them and say, hey, would you want to talk about this, with a view to helping other school districts or universities, defend against ransomware, recover from ransomware? And oftentimes they're like, yeah, they see like the educational component of it, right? Whereas other companies just see bad PR.
So pitching it as a way to help others is quite a good idea, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. The whole theme of the podcast really it was designed to say, "Hey, let's try to tackle this problem and learn from each other. It's okay to talk about it. There should be," and I say this in every episode after I do the intro. I said, there should be no shame in getting infected, but it's important to share the lessons. And so when I kind of pitch people, I say, yeah, just listen to it, and I think you'll understand that this isn't about, tell me how you got hacked, right? Like this is a really niche podcast. I understand the technical details. We can go into that. I want to go into that. And this is a view to help other information security practitioners do their defend themselves and also be fun too. I also like to try to have some humor in it and, some lighter moments because it is a very heavy topic and, IT teams take it hard when they get infected,
Well, some of the people you've spoken to have had very visceral, reactions, like personal stress when their organizations have been hacked.
It has totally taken me aback sometimes, the stories, of just how much it affected them, because I think there's, for IT security teams, it's like, a point of pride too. It's like somebody's just taken what you've built and destroyed it, right? And now you have to rebuild it and you're under a lot of stress. The company's not operational. There's a lot of stress from above. And I think, I didn't even really realize that because, I'm not like I'm a journalist, I'm not like an incident response person of just the gravity of all it all. And like, I just released the 8th episode, and that resulted, the person I spoke with was a security architect at TravelX when all that went down. And he ended up having a heart condition develop later in the year and had to have surgery. And he attributed, part of that to the stress of just that year. That was one of the most talked about ransomware incidents. They were infected in New Year's Eve 2019, but it was mostly talked about throughout 2020. But yeah, it was hard for him. I talked to a guy from Maersk who worked on their privilege access management team, and yeah, he was really deeply affected by it.
Ransomware can affect the health of a wider group of people too. The WannaCry attack damaged systems in the UK's National Health Service, and people who needed surgery, they didn't get it.
And then even more recently was the Conti's attack against Ireland's health executive. They had to call out the reserves to basically help, re-image machines, and so it gets really hairy, really quick.
It's not usually quite that dramatic.
There's always that potential because IT systems are at the core of everything we do, including the health system.
Well, and that school district that you reported on where even the buses couldn't run.
Yeah. Drivers, I did not even know this, because it's been so long since I was in primary school, but yeah, the bus drivers now use I don't know what they are, but it's like an electronic system now to basically map their route every day, I guess, to
because they can't remember it on a daily basis.
So yeah, that was down too, and lunch systems, and it's just like everything that works, on a a Windows server. I think in the first episode, that the school didn't have any sort of tally anymore of how much credit was on kids' lunch cards and things like that. So it's totally disruptive, and I think that's one of the key things too is that organizations never really realize how bad it's going to be when everything doesn't work, because nobody really thinks in those terms of this sort of total disaster. Most people are sort of tangentially aware of ransomware and might have kind of heard about it, small businesses too and things like that, but they don't really understand the gravity of what they'd have to do if everything doesn't work.
And the impact on a small business can be totally destructive, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And, small businesses are a big chunk of these kind of attacks too. And you don't hear about them as much as sort of the bigger ones, I guess, because there's probably a few reasons for that too. Big companies, it's probably more obvious, like universities and hospitals, right? When things don't work, people are like, why doesn't this work? And so, it becomes into the public consciousness really quickly. Whereas smaller businesses, not so much. I did a episode on a Australian business that it makes software to track supply chains. So say, for instance, Simon, you make yogurt. This company makes these systems that would put the expiry dates on the yogurt tubs, and so if you have to do a recall or whatever, you need to know that pallet is in West London, and that's the one we have to recall. So they do all that they call it intelligent tracking software. And they'd been hit by ransomware even before they had their big incident, but they didn't quite take the remediative steps they needed to take, and then the next time it happened, it was really bad. It was everything, all their databases and their ERP systems and HR and the whole nine yards. And they're just a successful Australian family owned business, and it's one that I think that one might have gotten in a couple of press reports, but just a lot of these businesses that are behind things that we use or consume every day, they're not necessarily who would know by name of an intelligent tracking company that makes it's just something that's just so specific that you probably would never have heard about it, but in their particular case, they were Australia's first double extortion victim. So not only did they encrypt their files, but they also started to release them. This was a group called PISA, which is called short for Protect Your System, Amigo. Nice guys.
Do you think, with these slightly obscure companies, do you think that they are targeted, or do you think that the attackers are sort of spamming stuff out and then seeing who bites and then taking it from there?
I think some are intentionally targeted, but I think a lot of them is just random, and you have to think of like the whole cyber criminal chain too, right? Because it's like you've got affiliates using ransomware developed by a main group. And those affiliates are often they're just buying access credentials from the IABs, the initial access brokers. And so those are the people that are just specializing in doing a lot of the phishing and making running botnets, you know doing large scale data collection of infected machines, right? And then sorting it out and going, all right, we've got credentials for, I don't know, Maersk, or we've got a bunch of credentials for Nabisco, or we've got a bunch of credentials for, Chelsea football team, their back office or whatever, and then, the affiliates are looking through that and going, yeah, okay, I'll buy those, see what works.
That's something we haven't touched on at all on this podcast, is the criminal industry that exists behind the headlines. The fact that there are some hackers that do the initial hacking and then they sell the information to other hackers who continue to do things like maybe what you might call the actual crime of data theft or data destruction.
Yeah, absolutely. All this stuff is just parceled out now, which is allowed for like a real specialty. So you no longer have to like be the one who, brute forces some companies, RDP that they find, and then, work at that for a couple of days until they can get in. They can just buy that stuff from somebody. And so it makes it nice and tidy of like, okay, you can already get in, right? So you can work on the next kind of phase of with ransomware gangs. It's often like reconnaissance, trying to look for Active Directory, trying to kind of create a network map, running all these sort of commands that allow you to get a grasp of like, okay, when I launch this ransomware, right, what am I gonna what can I hit? Where do I need to move into to perhaps cause sort of more damage? And then, even the whole customer service angle too to ransomware of like, once you're infected, you can go to a portal and start having a negotiating chat. And, even on the defensive side, there's a lot of parceling too, because your IR team comes in, your lawyers set up your IR team. Your lawyers may also have a negotiator on tap to be able to handle that, like an experienced negotiator, who can get if you are in a position where you must pay to resume your operations. So it's like almost on both sides, there's been a real parceling and specialization of these kind of like skills, that are related to an attack.
Yeah, and I'm thinking that, with the oil pipeline that was hacked, apparently they did pay the ransom, but the decryption software that was provided was too slow, so they ended up restoring from backups anyway. And it made me think that maybe the bad guys could actually compete with each other on the effectiveness of their own tools and their customer service.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Colonial Pipeline. So, with Colonial Pipeline, they shut down the pipeline because the ransomware wasn't in their operational technology part, but it was in everything else. And I think they kind of panicked and paid. And you're exactly right. When the group gave the decryption key back, they discovered quickly that actually their backups were decent, and restoring from those backups was going to be faster than using the key. So like when you get the key from them, like a private key that unlocks either all of the computers, all of the files, or sometimes there's sort of different keys involved too. But when you get that back, it's just not, and I think a lot of companies don't realize this either, is that it's not just like you don't have your house keys and I have your house keys, and I say, Simon, okay, give me 20 pounds and I'll give you your house keys back, and you just walk in and everything's fine, right? It's more like I come into your house, remove everything, and then right, and then you say, okay, Simon, I'll give you your stuff back, and you're like, I give you the key and you open the house, you're like, well, where's my stuff? And you're like, oh no, it's more complicated than that. I got to bring a truck by it and put everything back.
And I've stored all the bits across the UK in different different parts of the country, so it's going to take quite a long time to get it all there.
Exactly. So when you get the key material, right, this is just like really raw kind of stuff. And it's not like optimized for a quick restoration like your backups would be, right? Your backups are all, you know, most backup providers can do that pretty quickly, depending on what your sort of architecture is. So I think, if I were to tell a company something, it's like, don't think you just pay and everything goes back to normal. That's not it at all. It may be still weeks and weeks of work to get things up and running if you pay. And then you've got all those costs in addition to the ransom, all those normal recovery costs that you would, have after attack of that sort of magnitude.
So talking about payment, should companies pay? Have you spoken to any who regretted it or think that they did the right thing?
Well, that is a fantastic question, and you know what? I've not been able to get an organization that has paid the ransom.
At least one that submitted to it.
Right, right. Well, actually, they were all the ones that were very open, and all the people in the episodes were very open about it. So that they didn't pay, but TravelX did pay in episode 8. But I didn't directly speak with people at TravelX now. Like we know they paid because that was the reporting, and also what the our evil gang said. Um,
Mm.
I think there's a lot of shame around it, and I think like, look, there should be no shame in it. But the important thing to think about, like, would you pay or not pay, is that you need to sort of think about under what conditions that would be something that you would have to do prior to this happening. And so I'll give you kind of like an example, right? Like, say for instance, like, so you have backups, or you think you have good backups, and you get infected, and then suddenly your team goes through and figures out, oh wait, these backups are they're just corrupted, or maybe the ransomware gang had got to them and was able to delete them.
Mm.
And you have to kind of think about, like, okay, well, say only 10% of your backups are corrupted, or right, or kind of trashed. Or like, would you pay in that instance? It's like, well, that kind of depends on, well, what data was on it. So you need to also kind of like have tiers of like, what's your crown jewels, as they say, and what's the value of your data, and how much would you potentially pay to get it back. So I mean, if you have like, you're going to lose 10% in corruption, actually it's usually about 30% to like corruptions and other problems, easily say like, no, we don't have to pay, we can take the hit of the lost data, or whatever. But all these things need to be thought about before, because the gangs are running counters saying like, we're going to double your ransom, if you don't pay within this number of days. And so it's good to be able to like get a lay of like, well, what's the sort of damage, and you know how bad is it going to be. I mean, generally, you shouldn't pay any, but I went to a Gartner session actually a couple of days ago here in Sydney, and one of their experts on ransomware was saying, at the end of the day, it's a business decision, and that's made by the board of a company, and they have to take it into account of like how long they're going to be disrupted, how long they're going to be down. And he kind of advised security practitioners. He's like, look, like, it's not going to be up to you on whether to pay or not. Like, that's not your decision. Like, your role is to basically be impartial, and, give a tally of the damage and your recommendation on how quickly you'll be up and running. It's certainly a moral question though, too. I mean, these gangs have, some of them have had hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And they've been able to, buy bugs, buy 0-day bugs. There's strong evidence that they might have been buying 0-day exploits and 0-day bugs, and that's pretty scary. It's not just like taking advantage of the low-hanging fruit. It's like, because I think of Kaseya in this instance. So because Kaseya was aware of all the bugs that the R Evil gang used. Most of them. They were warned 3 months prior, and they were racing to patch. But then somehow our evil figured out some of the same ones, and even some different ones, and then did that attack. So everyone's like, well, how'd they figure this out, right? Like, how did they figure out these bugs? And we still don't really know.
That's interesting, because when I was thinking about reasons why you shouldn't pay, I was thinking less about the business decisions and more about the moral question. and I hadn't considered that they will use some of the funds that they appropriate to actually improve their skills and their reach. So it just becomes worse. And of course, you also don't know if they're going to come back at you again. If they've found that you are a payer, maybe they still have a backdoor into your systems and they can hit you twice. So maybe there's a more practical reason not to pay as well.
Yeah, yeah, you're absolutely right. In fact, at the Gartner session, I think they said that if you're hit once, there's an 80% chance you're going to get hit either by the same gang or by a different one, like really quickly. In fact, some of these have been turned into kind of like pitched battles, right? Like literally there's IR people trying to kick them out of the system and they're getting back in, or they've got some other foothold in that they're able to use. And so it's an actual kind of like, sort of cyber battle, to get the ransomware people out. But yeah, it's those the adversaries are they're very good now, and they're professionalized. And yeah, like I said, it's like they can fund, they can buy bugs. And that's just puts it on a whole other level, especially when you talk about like defense for SMBs. It's just something like, it's like you probably, if you're not doing the basics right, you don't have a chance.
Given the sophistication of the sort of cyber criminal underworld, we've got to wonder if they work totally in isolation from other criminal elements, or whether if you were some big mafia boss, you might decide that the future isn't heroin anymore, it's going to be cyber. And some of these guys are under the control of some people who will do more real world nasty things like people smuggling, for example. So then if you are paying a ransom, what you're doing is paying into some pretty disgusting criminal organizations.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. Yeah, you never know what what other bad actors are even expanding into. Yeah, you're funding an industry that's very destructive to your peers. I mean, it's just. I think I listened to a podcast. It was by MIT. It was called The Extortion Economy, but it was about ransomware, and it was a terrific kind of mini series. And it starts off with like a tale of what happened, and like kidnappings were really prevalent in Italy in the 70s. And finally Italy said, okay, nobody can pay ransoms. And so two things happened. There were some absolute tragedies because of that. And then secondly, uh kidnapping went away. Like it just faded. So the question has been, for policymakers is like, well, should countries ban ransom payments? And I was kind of like, well, it seems like a logical way to nip it in the bud, and it would. But at the same time, it's like, well, if a company pays a ransom, right, to prevent itself from going out of business and having 30 people made redundant, and then having to face prosecutors, right, because they paid a ransom to try to save their business, and we're all expending, court time and prosecutors prosecuting a company that was just trying to save itself. It just doesn't make sense. It just breaks down really quickly. So I think the only path really is just to encourage organizations like to do the best that they can on the budgets that they have, to at least get rid of the low hanging fruit and make it harder, right? Because right now we're really at a situation where if you make it a little bit hard, they'll probably go away and just find somebody else who's a little bit easier. So once that all kind of improves, hopefully it will start. But I think we're really years and years away from this problem going away in a meaningful way.
How do the attacks generally start? Just from the people that you've talked to, is it always phishing, or are there other ways?
Yeah, it's a lot of phishing and malicious email. So yeah, capturing credentials through phishing attacks. Um, sending malicious links that lead people to phishing sites. I mean, just sending people, you know, uh, invoices that are actually, malware macros, like macros, like turn off macros. If you don't have to use macros, just don't use macros.
Welcome back to the 90s.
Yeah, it's just one of those things, it's often like targeting people like in HR and, people or, in departments like that that deal with like a high volume of emails and just trying to get somebody to, open something up. And I mean, that's been, I think, in like at least 3 or 4 of the episodes, that's just been it. It's just been a phishing email with a malicious attachment that is a Trojan downloader that calls out to another server to download something else. They move around for a while. It's usually that's like an initial access broker. They download like an Emotet, or what was
Hmm.
Emotet, or TrickBot. Those were two notorious botnets that were often the initial piece of malware on a machine that later led to, because then the TrickBot and the Emotet people sold off those you know hacked boxes to the ransomware folks, and then they would come in and ransom
Hmm.
people. So it's just it's very much a lot of the same sort of stuff. And of course, like zero-day vulnerabilities. I mean, you know there was I mentioned like Travelex, right? It looks like Travelex never actually confirmed how they were infected. But there was very strong evidence they did have unpatched pulse secure VPNs. And so this was in early 2020. So actually it was just kind of prior to the pandemic. But when the pandemic happened, a lot of companies just had to like expand their VPNs. And so that just created a very, wide attack surface. And a lot of those, like I think it was like Fortinet, Pulse Secure, Palo Alto, a lot of those VPN products had vulnerabilities that were discovered, and the patching just wasn't as fast as it needed to be.
Mm.
So that's another thing. Everybody knows, patch quickly, but it's easy to say it. It's much harder to do it because every organization is different and complex and has their own things going on.
It's the classic advice, though, isn't it? Run antivirus, patch your systems. It's the 5 easy things that you can do to secure yourself, but actually they're not always that easy to do.
Yeah, not at all.
But people can get all wound up about ransomware being a type of threat, but it's not really. It's a payload. And so when we're talking about your router or any other element of your infrastructure, as long as you know there's a risk, you can make decisions to mitigate those risks because you can have defense in depth. So, for example, if because you work in computer security reporting, you may feel that you might be a target and you've got this router and you don't have control of it, and Jeremy, that this router probably has some vulnerabilities in it. So how can you protect yourself? Well, one way would be to put a second router on the inside. And this is another thing you've got to plug in. But if you think that you're at risk, it's a very inexpensive way to create a demilitarized zone, something that people used to do in the old days with firewalls before next generation firewalls.
Yeah.
And this means that if there's a vulnerability in your router, someone who's automating the attacks, they can take over your first router, but the chances that they will then automatically scan from that router, find your other one, exploit a vulnerability in that as well automatically is super, super low. So for about $20, you can mitigate that threat. And then when we talk about ransomware, people aren't just out there pushing ransomware. They are doing full-on hacking attacks. It's a full attack chain to take you all the way down to that point where you can run some code on an endpoint, and that would be ransomware in this case, or maybe a data wiper, or maybe just exfiltrate data silently. If people followed best practices in general for cyber hygiene, not only would they kind of fix their ransomware problem, but they would fix all sorts of other cyber security issues as well.
Yeah, entirely. Yeah, I'd agree with
It
that.
sounds like I'd written the script there, but that was just all from my head.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think like at least we're kind of lucky that the ransomware actors moved on from consumers too. Like probably 8 or 9 years ago, my father-in-law got hit by ransomware, and I think they wanted like, I don't know, $300 or something, and he didn't pay. He lost part of he was a university professor. I think he lost part of something, but generally he was kind of unscathed. But I mean, I guess like, I mean, that's really, kind of, it was kind of terrible. I mean, consumers, to kind of hit consumers, at least with companies, I mean, they can better defend themselves.
But they've got more value as well, haven't they? Because when I speak to consumers, which I have to admit isn't that often, they'll often say, well, why do I need to care about VPNs or antivirus? I haven't got anything worthwhile. Now, they're wrong because there's plenty that they do have. But if your average person loses their laptop, it's usually the concern is about the physical value of that system, not their data.
Yes. Yeah.
So consumers probably aren't the best target for ransomware attackers because they don't have the funds and they don't have the motivation to pay.
Yeah, exactly. And they figured that out around 2015, 2014, 2015. They're like, wait, we can attack companies and get a whole lot more dosh.
Yeah. But they're being efficient businesses. As you mentioned earlier, they've split their roles, they've split their risk. So the people who are doing the initial attacks, that's the high risk part because you can be detected. Well, they're not then doing the extortion, so they're less exposed and they're just being more efficient in the background.
Yeah, totally.
Ransomware groups. So we've got these groups of people who are doing the extortions. How can we attribute those? Or should we not bother? Should we just focus on protection and not worry that it's this group or that group?
Yeah, that's a really good question, right? Because it's a real just soup of gang names, right? And I would say you can do both, and other people do this too, right? So attribution is important because you do want to try to keep track of the groups and what they're doing and try to get as much as you can from possible associations. Like a lot of this stuff is like really, really murky though. But I think one thing that's been quite encouraging is that, ransomware actors have pretty bad OPSEC, right? And so it's worth really kind of digging into it because I know with Kaseya, for instance, there was someone indicted for the Kaseya attack, and also for the one in Texas too, and I forget which is which now. But one guy's in Russia, and another guy was actually arrested in Poland and extradited to I believe to Texas. I believe it was Texas. The guy was caught. So there's always a chance of attaching real names to these people, and we've seen particularly the United States has filed indictments against state sponsored well, actually not even state sponsored, but intelligence agents for Russia and China, alleged intelligence agents for doing various cyber attacks. So I think especially with resources and the Five Eyes, the fact that we saw even with the recovery of Colonial Pipelines, they recovered part of the ransom, right? They make all kinds of mistakes, and it may be possible to those mistakes may lead to identities. They may lead to recovery of ransoms paid, which is wonderful. But they do kind of change and they kind of morph. But it's important to, Mandia does a lot of research. And I mean, there's lots of, I shouldn't just call out Mandia, but I mean, there's a lot of threat intelligence companies that study the methods that they use too, on a technical level. And that's pretty important for, defense too, because when they're starting to do something new and that can be caught somewhere in that chain of things that ransomware actors do, it can give a little bit of an edge to defenders and hopefully be able to shut it down sort of automatically. There's a lot of stuff going on with I don't know if your company does this kind of testing with the EDR software, and now it's like XDR.
We specialize in that actually.
Oh, terrific. So a whole lot about this, but it's really amazing compared to say a decade ago what can be done now, as far as okay, we've detected something in the MITRE attack frame and a MITRE attack framework that this group is known for this. So we can go, all right, shut off that endpoint. And that's going to save, a lot of organizations too. And it only gets better as well too. It can get more refined, and there's a lot of just customization available, I think, in security products. But I'll let you. I'll ask you that. What do you think? I should be asking you rather than blathering on here. Tell me about it. How's it different from say 2010?
Well, the full attack chain is really important. And as you say, with the MITRE attack framework, what they did was to look at the different attack groups and to kind of classify the tactics and the kind of tools that they use to achieve their goals. So if you talk about APT3, for example, they may start off with a phishing email and then do this, do that, escalate privileges, do key logging, whatever. You've got this kind of playbook, or they've got all these different playbooks for different groups. And they can be quite similar because even in 2020, the way of hacking a system in principle is pretty much the same as it is today. It's just the details
Yeah.
change,
Yeah.
the types of 0 days, that kind of thing. But when you're doing a test, the way that we do the test is we look at those different groups and we say, well, we're going to pretend to be the sandworm group or dragonfly versions 1 and 2, or something else, and something else. You have these series, and we can say, well, this firewall or this EDR product handled maybe the initial part of the attack quite well, but if we were able to get through to the point of escalating privileges, then it stopped noticing what we're doing. Or this product spotted everything in the attack chain. So if you used it in the real world, and attackers continue to work in a kind of similar way to how they have for the last 20 years, so probably will do, then there's a pretty good chance that this product will detect some stages of that attack, and then you'll know that you've been compromised.
That's really interesting. And so I assume that no product does everything perfectly, right? And so I guess the question is, without without naming names of like, I mean, do you have what goes into the decision of like what EDR product to use, or what should you think about, I guess?
Well, there's a whole bunch of things, but if you were a large organization, the first thing you might consider is price. You would consider whether or not it's a competent product, and a lot of companies just look at that top right quarter of the Gartner Magic Quadrant. So it's
Yes.
helps them get gets their shopping list sort of shortened down a bit. And then you might look at what your staff already know. So, for example, just to use a company name randomly, let's just say that your firewall is a Fortinet firewall and you use a Fortinet email gateway. When you come to choose an endpoint product or something else, you might be biased towards choosing Fortinet because your staff are already familiar with the products, and maybe by having things combined in that way, things will connect better, and you'll have an XDR kind of solution all in one hit.
Yeah.
So it's not always about price, it's not always about effectiveness, and nothing is ever 100%. But what we do find is some of the top tier products do very well. So when you see the reports on our website, generally people are in the high 90s, and partially that's because some of the companies that we test with aren't very good, and we don't then publish those reports because they don't want us to. And so in some cases, they're quite new companies who are trying to establish their product, and they use us as a kind of quality assurance service. So we come in and say, well, actually, guys, you missed all of this, but here's what you can do to help fix it. So
they kind of use you as like an auditor, like almost before. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, because we're testing like hackers. We're basically behaving in exactly the same way as the bad guys, but we're not bad. So that's the main difference. Is hopefully we're not going to jail at some stage. How do companies try to prevent ransomware? Is it all security product related, or what about, say, staff awareness?
So we did just a chat about like phishing training and things, how different companies deal with like repeat offenders, like employees that just continually get fooled by phishing emails, which was a really interesting discussion actually. The TLDR is like, yeah, some companies just fire people who repeatedly fail that kind of training, which I found really kind of wow, kind of taken aback by that.
That's terrible because they're just trying to do their jobs.
Yeah, that's what I think too. And I also think, a second point, it's like, well, look, if somebody gets phished, there's a whole lot of other points in that sort of kill chain, right? Like, and if you're just blaming how it started, right, and not catching any of the 25 things that happened afterwards, that's on you, security team, right?
That's exactly right. That's the full attack chain thing that we were just talking about.
Yeah, yeah. So if you're not using anything to catch any of those other signs, that's probably on you then. Because the technology's out there. And look, it's not cheap either. I mean, I realize like these these top tier products are really expensive and definitely out of the reach of a lot of businesses that, SMBs, that probably aren't going to make such an investment, in it. I mean, sometimes in like hindsight, I think if like, a company went out of business and you'd say, well, would you spend it now? And they probably would have been like, yeah, definitely,
Hmm.
but I guess it's hard. There's still kind of a barrier of like, do you realize that this could be an existential event for your company? And then of course we've got the scenario where the attack has come from somebody else in your organization, like their email account has been hacked. So actually it's not even like, oh, I've done a bit of domain, kind of spoof type of squatting, domain spoofing, you didn't catch the extra zero or whatever or O, in the domain
Hmm.
name, and now I fooled you. It's like, no, the hackers are using somebody else in your organization's legitimate email address and delivering you something that perhaps you even expected. Like look at BEC. Like those
Hmm.
people sit around for weeks and observe communication patterns between people in companies before they actually do something.
Well, we do BEC testing. So when we test email services, we do exactly that. We set up an organization that's the target, and then we have real customers and suppliers, and we also have typo squatting equivalents and other things. And we do consultancy too. So I've been in a situation where I've been into an organization and I've seen their compromised email accounts. And to be quite honest, Jeremy, it's not that hard to do. And some of the basic stuff that the attackers do include email forwarding rules. So, every time you receive a statement of work or whatever, I get to have a copy of that appear in my Gmail account in another country. And then I know when the invoices are due and I know what the invoices look like. And I can then send you an invoice for 100,000, euros or whatever, and you'll pay it. And then I'm happy.
Yeah, I know that's one of the tips that they say is like, well, be sure. Can you turn off email forwarding in some of the Microsoft products? Or
Well, yeah, but you have to go looking for it. So you go into your settings in Google or Microsoft, and you'll see the forwarding rules. And you would go, well, why is that there? And you disable it. But it's another auditing job. Do you, as the user, are you responsible for that, or is it the admin? And in Office 365, you can actually disable email forwarding as a feature,
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
which probably these days is quite a good idea.
Yeah, entirely. Because a lot of it is, yeah, it's just process based, right? It's like you've already got the technology to stop some of this stuff, and also just like the usual, like, okay, well, if you get an invoice over a certain amount, you've got to make a phone call to that, supplier, and verify the account numbers, and
Mm.
just taking more time. It's like you don't even need any technology to go, I'm just going to run this bank account number by, because we noticed that it changed from the ones that we typically use, and doing that. I mean, so much of it is just literally like a different account number that nobody noticed.
I think it's fair to say that most of us believe that ransomware is a bad thing, but concepts like good and bad are subjective. Ransomware represents a threat to us in our businesses, our bank accounts, but as with many areas of life, the idea that something is definitely bad or definitely completely good is overly simple. We see this with the software we run on our personal and business computers. You might consider Microsoft Word or Outlook to be good, meaning that you want to use them, although I know a few people who believe Excel to be evil incarnate. But we're talking about, do you definitely intend to have those applications on your computer? And many people do want Microsoft Office programs like Outlook, PowerPoint, and so on. So we can generalize and say that they are, inverted commas, good. And ransomware is almost certainly something you don't want to find on your system, unless you're a researcher playing with it in a protected environment. So in most circumstances, we can label ransomware as, inverted commas, bad. But there is a less certain area between these two very clear standards, a grey zone where you might want an app but end up with something more or less than you bargained for. These are the potentially unwanted applications, or PUAs, and they can play psychological tricks to persuade you to install them. Dennis Batchelder is president of AppEsteem, which focuses on certifying the sorts of apps that you might want to have installed on your computer. And he's also the CEO of the Anti-Malware Testing Standards Organization. So he's very focused on helping you and businesses work safely with your computers. Dennis, in the security industry, We hear terms like potentially unwanted applications. Anything could be potentially unwanted, couldn't it?
So let's break up software into three categories. You have stuff that criminals build that you don't want on your machine ever. We'll call that malware, or even unwanted, stuff that we know is bad. And then there's stuff that we know is good, things that is wanted on your machine that you want because you're trying to get something done. And then there's this in-between category, which is, I'm not sure, I want to check it out, I want to test it. And that could be potentially unwanted if it's trying to take advantage of a consumer, you as a consumer.
Right, so if I'm the user and I want to download WinZip or some other kind of useful utility, and my antivirus tells me that it's potentially unwanted, why is it doing that? What's actually going on?
Imagine you go to a download site and you want to get WinZip. There are plenty of enterprising companies out there who try and say, I want to make a buck while you download WinZip. So I'm going to bundle my software with WinZip so that when you install WinZip, you'll be asked, hey, would you also like this free piece of software? Or would you like to try this out? And then you'll get a screen. The user gets a screen that says, do you want to also install this other software? You're going to love it. It's free. That could be potentially unwanted.
But wouldn't I just say no to all those extras?
You could. In fact, if it's done correctly, and it's wanted software, you can easily say no and you won't get tricked. And that's the ideal case, is that you got offered something else, you say no, and everybody says fine, and the installation moves on and you get what you were looking for. Right. You could say yes as well, and you might be surprised. Hey, I got this extra bonus app that I didn't even know I was going to get. That would be the good case. The bad case would be install this or, puppies will die. Right, install this because your computer is going to have problems.
So you could have a situation where users are being coerced into installing software that they don't want.
So I would say that users could be tricked, coerced, threatened, fooled, scared in some way into installing the software.
Do you remember the fake antivirus software? Is that an extreme example of unwanted or potentially unwanted applications?
Yeah, I would call the fake antivirus where they and we should talk about the difference between unwanted and potentially unwanted. Something that's unwanted is something is bad. So fake antivirus is a great case. Someone's offering you that they are an antivirus product, but yet it doesn't detect malware. That is an example of fake AV, that they're trying to take your money to get something that they don't deliver.
They're going to say you have 1,000 viruses on your computer and it's going to cost you $35 to clear them off, but there aren't actually any viruses on your computer.
So either there's no viruses on your computer or they don't clear anything off, right? And either case is bad and they cheated you, and that makes it unwanted. A potentially unwanted app would be an antivirus product that says, ooh, you got all these bad things, and it alarms you, like unfairly alarms you to pay for a product, scares you first, shows you all these bad things with the computer, and then charges you to fix them without offering to fix it for free.
And people should care about this because in that obvious case, they can lose money. But what about the WinZip situation? Does it really matter if they install some software that they don't really need?
It's possible that software that they installed is going to scare them later. And so those bits that try and get on your machine, there's this whole ecosystem that takes place behind that WinZip application where someone's trying to make money off from a consumer.
So really the principle is just don't trick the user. If you're being dishonest at that early stage, you might do more dishonest things later.
Right. If you trick the user to get on the machine, or the consumer got fooled to get that software installed, you can generally expect it's not going to be a well-behaving application if they had to fool you to get there.
Right, so you've downloaded your WinZip or whatever software and you've started installing it. And you may see some options to continue to install these other applications that you don't necessarily want. Where do you draw the line between what's okay and what's not okay?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if when you're installing an application and it has an advertisement that says, hey, would you like to try this? And it's not in your flow of installing, like it's off on the side, then that's pretty much okay behavior. It's just an advertisement that's taking place. Where it gets tricky is where you insert that offer into the flow of installing the program. So you think you're accepting the licensing agreement or the privacy policy, but really you're accepting to install this other software.
Is that just a case of lazy users clicking next, next, next? Or is it more devious than that?
Yeah, I think humans have this vulnerability. We all have this vulnerability where when we install software, we rely on muscle memory just to get through the process. I mean, we wanted something, we want to get it on the box. We've done it 100 times before. We just hit next, next, next because we know it doesn't matter. We're just going to finish it at the end of the day. And so a lot of companies, these build potentially unwanted apps who take advantage of this vulnerability in people who just want to get through the process, and they get their extra software installed on their machine.
Do you ever see cultural differences being exploited, or at least misunderstood here? Say the colour green might mean go for some and red might mean stop or watch out, but in others, red might be encouraging.
Yeah, I think colors make a difference in different cultures, but pretty much what we see in the unwanted space and the potentially unwanted space is when someone is splashing a lot of red color in front of you, the app is showing lots of red, they're generally trying to drive you into buying something or coercing you or tricking you into buying something.
Right, so red is making someone feel anxious. It's a warning.
Yeah, it's a warning for them, just like a traffic light means stop or an alarm, or you see on the side of the road, you'll see a sign in either orange or red that says danger ahead or detour coming.
Let's take the average internet user. Well, they're like a lamb to the slaughter. There are all these apps out there trying to trick them. And what can they do not to be tricked, to keep their money and to avoid bits of almost malware running on their systems?
Yeah, I think the first thing that a user needs to do is make sure his antivirus is up to date. And I would secondly check and make sure that antivirus is actually pretty good at fighting PUA. Several AVs out there do not really spend any effort in fighting potentially unwanted software.
But why not? Surely they can just block everything that isn't definitely good. What's their problem?
Yeah, that it's difficult to decide what's good or what's bad. It's really easy with malware because they're criminals and they're trying to hide who they are. But with software developed by reputable companies or companies who have signing certificates and they don't hide who they are, they say, I built this software, it gets more tricky because now the AV has to worry about, might they be sued if they detect this app?
Right. So there are potentially legal issues involved.
There might be legal issues involved. In fact, if you go back 10 years in this industry, there were an awful lot of lawsuits from companies suing antivirus companies for detecting their software or restricting their business in some way. And that was, I think, probably because in those earlier days, there were not really good rules put in place about what's considered potentially unwanted versus what's unwanted versus what's malware versus what's clean. And so every company was kind of doing it themselves. The antivirus companies were doing their best to protect their customers. And these other applications didn't like that, right? Especially when they felt like it was unjustified.
We've talked a bit about false positives in the first series of this podcast. This is when security products make mistakes and falsely accuse legitimate objects as being malicious. And when an antivirus detects a potentially unwanted piece of software, and the person who wrote that software is not happy about it, they would claim that's a false positive, right?
Yeah, the third party would generally say, you're detecting me by mistake. And they may be right. It really depends what they're doing. And so what we believe is that an antivirus company has a responsibility. If they're going to detect a third-party app that has a valid signature, it's not written by a malicious author who's trying to hide who he is, they should have a reason, and they should be able to share that reason with the vendor for why they're detecting them.
Do the antivirus vendors usually have some kind of process whereby they can get the kind of feedback?
So the antivirus vendors generally have a way to respond. They might take months to respond. They might give a form answer. Or they might be really good and diligent and saying, hey, Mr. Vendor, change these 3 or 4 things and your app will be good to go. And not every AV is at the same level.
How are you involved in all this?
What AppEsteem does is AppEsteem tries to develop a generally accepted set of rules about what's considered unwanted software and what's considered potentially unwanted software. And what we hope to do is to work with the vendors to make sure that they build apps that are wanted. And if they build apps that are wanted, then the antivirus companies won't detect them. So we teach those companies how to build their apps in ways that are not tricking users, taking advantage of the consumers, or trying to scare them. And so we work hard with them and certify their apps. And then we bring those apps to the antivirus companies and say, these come from vendors who are willing to work with you and change their apps. And we've checked them and we think they're doing everything necessary that you shouldn't detect them.
So they get a badge for good behavior, and that gives them an advantage with the antivirus companies.
I don't know if the antivirus companies would think it gives them an advantage. I think that any vendor could do all this stuff without us just fine. It's just there's a whole bunch of antivirus companies out there, and we understand all their different rules.
You're doing the work for some of the antivirus companies in a way.
Yeah, so right. What we do for the vendor is we help them understand all the different rules from all the antivirus companies so they can make the right decisions about what to do. And we're helping the antivirus companies because we've cleaned them up, and now that vendor doesn't have to contact that antivirus company. They just talk to us instead, and they can save time as well. So we've added an efficiency into the system with this badge, with this certification.
So you've taken the heat out of the conversations between the ones that aren't doing it on purpose. They're not suing straight away because they have better communication going on with everybody. And the ones who are totally bad, well, they know that they're bad. And you're saying that they're bad and they're getting blocked, and there's not really much more to say about that.
So now those vendors, even if they didn't get an answer back from the antivirus and they think they need to sue, they can come to us and get an answer from us about why their app is being detected. And we can help them get it right. And we also have a deceptor list where we can put the apps that won't change or aren't changing on that list, and all antivirus companies detect those apps.
And now, just before we finish, it's security life hack time. At the end of each episode, we give a special security tip that works for real people in the real world, for work and in their personal lives. This episode's life hacker is longtime security expert and firewall whisperer Brian Monkman.
One of the things that really jumped out at me was practicing losing your phone and laptop. I can tell you from personal experience that, not that I physically lost them, but I lost things from the point of view of I suddenly couldn't get access, or I needed to make some changes to things and wasn't sure, that sort of thing. And most of the vendors of laptops, phones, and so on have really good tools built into their platforms to facilitate recovery. But it's really stressful to be learning that stuff when you actually need it. So I would strongly recommend that you practice it and get familiar with tools before you actually need it. You'll find that recovery will go a lot smoother. Take it from someone who's learned the hard way.
Please subscribe, and if you enjoyed this episode, please send a link to just one of your close colleagues. We also have a free email newsletter. Sign up on our website, where you'll also find this episode's show notes and bonus episodes featuring full-length interviews with our guests. Just visit decodedcyber.com. And that's it. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again soon.